Tilde. Harry Potter's Hermione Granger is now black, and as a result, the internet exploded. So, continuing the theme of the last few months, where race is apparently the big hot-button issue again, combining this with what we've seen happen a few times this year, where canonic characters are changed in some way for no real discernible reason whatsoever, other than to cause controversy and sell more units. We are today going to be looking at some fantasy lore, considering some canon, and questioning what exactly makes a character established. And then we will look at everything surrounding this entire issue, and hopefully you will be able to draw your own conclusions from the evidence presented. And before we go any further, I would just like to quickly clarify that it is in fact pronounced Leviosa, not Leviosa. It's very important that you know that. Let's begin. So this entire event was kicked off a few months ago when it was announced that there would be a play following up the very successful Harry Potter books entitled Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and that this play would take place after the events of the books and indeed the films. And this was met with obvious eagerness and excitement from the Harry Potter fan community. And recently, the cast list was announced. And it was revealed that the three leads were going to be played by Jamie Park, taking the role of Harry Potter, Paul Thornley, coming in as Ron Weasley, and Noma Dumezweni, appearing as Hermione Granger. Now, some people may look at this cast and compare it to, say, the cast from the recent Harry Potter films, and some people spotted a little bit of a continuity error, as it were, and I myself noticed it as well. Ron isn't Ginger anymore. The hell is up with that? But a few of the more eagle-eyed in the audience noticed that Hermione seems to have gone from being white to being black. And this fact caused a little bit of debate on the internet, and of course started throwing up all sorts of questions as to what ethnicity Hermione Granger actually is. Because the important thing to remember is that the Harry Potter films are not actually necessarily perfectly reflective of the source material in the books, because obviously when you turn a book into a film, you will often find yourself having to miss certain scenes out or to add certain scenes in to ensure continuity. And in some cases you may have to tweak little facts or details about the characters, depending on which actors are available to play the roles, the actors or the director's interpretation of those characters, and so on and so forth. And obviously this led to some people scouring through the source material to try and find any indication of the actual ethnicity of Hermione Granger, to either confirm that she is in fact white, or if she is in fact black, or she may in fact be something completely different. So let's build this issue from the very ground up. First of all, I'd like to address the issue in fiction of reasonable inference. Let's take a reasonably famous story by a reasonably famous author who you may have heard of. Let's say Macbeth by William Shakespeare. A play set in the 11th century with the overwhelming majority of the scenes being in Scotland. I believe there's a couple in England as well. Now, in the story of Macbeth, it is never expressly stated that any of the characters are white, or indeed even that they are Scottish. But because of the time period that the book is set in, because obviously it was a story written in a time before mass immigration and mass transport was a thing, and looking at the names of the characters and the general geographical region that it is a reasonable inference to say that the cast is entirely Scottish, English, or just generally British. Now, why do I bring this up as an example? Well, when we look at the character of Hermione Granger, we know that she is a person living in England, or at least somewhere in Britain, given that that is where she always returns to from Hogwarts School. Now, just because she lives in Britain in the modern era, that of course doesn't mean that she is white. After all, Britain is a very racially diverse country. However, it is very important to note that Britain is still a majority white country, So that is a first piece of evidence to make a reasonable inference that her character could be white. It is, however, nowhere near conclusive. So let's go one step further and look at her name, Hermione Granger. Hermione is a name of European origin, being the feminine form of the Greek name Hermes. And Granger is an occupational namesake, of which Britain has many, Granger in this instance being the name of someone who would work in a granary. Occupational namesakes are quite common in Britain. For instance, the surname Taylor is obviously historically linked to people who would have been tailors or haberdashers. The surname Shoesmith, obviously from someone who would smith shoes, either as a farrier or a cobbler. So both of the names of the character Hermione Granger are of very distinct European origin, with the surname being a distinctly British surname. However, once again, this is nowhere near conclusive evidence. After all, you can name your children and indeed your family whatever the hell you want to, because after all, a name is in no way immediately indicative of race. It is much more a product of the culture that you are living in. But this is another piece of evidence that certainly lends credence as to why some people would make the reasonable inference that the character of Hermione Granger is supposed to be white. However, a name does not a race make. So let's look at a few more things surrounding this issue before we go any further. In response to the fan confusion, J.K. Rowling herself even took to Twitter saying, "Canon, brown eyes, frizzy hair, and very clever. White skin was never specified. Rowling loves Black Hermione." So there you have it, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. The author of the books has fully endorsed a black actress to be Hermione in the play. Case closed, right? Well, not necessarily. Let us for a moment consider the Harry Potter film series, and specifically J.K. Rowling's involvement with them. You see, J.K. Rowling was in fact no slacker when it came to the film adaptations of her books. She did in fact work very closely not only with the directors but also with the actors within those films. In fact, it was at her own insistence that the overwhelming majority of the cast be British actors, because she refused to allow her films to be shot in the US using American actors because she thought that it would ruin the films. And to give you an idea of how closely tied she was to the actors in the production, she even went out of her way to give away certain spoilers and secrets that hadn't been published in books yet to actors like Alan Rickman and Robbie Coltrane, to make sure that there wouldn't be any inconsistencies in their performances with regards to later reveals for films later in the series. With the author of the books being so heavily involved and influential with how the films were made, I personally find it very hard to believe that at no point during filming, or indeed prior to filming, did Rowling consider Emma Watson and say that she was the wrong colour because Hermione is supposed to be black. Given that this was the first major adaptation from her books, I can't help but think that her lack of objection of the ethnicity of Emma Watson in this role is somewhat telling that Rowling intended Hermione Granger to be white. While we're talking about the films and race and continuity, I think it would be remiss of me to not mention now the rather curious case of Lavender Brown, who you would probably know best from the films The Half-Blood Prince and The Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, being played by the actress Jessica Cave. And these are the last 3 films in the franchise. However, before these 3 films, the character of Lavender Brown was actually portrayed by 2 other actresses, Kathleen Cooley and Jennifer Smith, both of whom are black. Now, these first two actors portraying Lavender Brown did so in non-speaking background roles, but they were maintained there for a sense of continuity, so that at least the background members of the class that the main three protagonists are in would look very similar throughout all of the films, so that it wouldn't be too jarringly obvious that everyone else had changed from film to film. And yet, as soon as she entered a speaking role and became the pseudo-love interest of Ron Weasley, she is suddenly replaced with a white girl. So, race changing is not something uncommon to the Harry Potter franchise, especially in regards to the films. And this change, of course, happened with the obvious knowledge of the directors, producers, casters, and possibly Rowling herself. Now, recasting someone between a non-speaking role to a speaking role is not massively uncommon and did in fact happen to other characters as well. But of course this particular change led to a little bit of online backlash regarding the topic of whitewashing, as you would expect it to. But anyway, this is somewhat a side tangent, and just something which I found somewhat interesting, that a race change of a named established character can happen under Rowling's very nose in films that she is involved in, and she doesn't actually say a word. But this does bring up a question of whether this change was done at the behest of Rowling, or whether it's sheer coincidence and she didn't notice or didn't care. Personally, I think this particular instance is also bullshit, for the exact same reason that I think the race change for Hermione is complete bullshit. And this comes down to the important issue of character establishment, and then also throws up the issue of canon book being adapted into film, and then can a film ever supersede a book as canon? Both the characters of Hermione Granger and Lavender Brown, while they obviously have very different impacts in the story insofar as one is a main protagonist and the other is more of a background character, neither of them have their race expressly stated in the books. However, when it came to the films, a choice was made. Emma Watson, a white actress, was chosen for the role of Hermione Granger, and Jennifer Smith was chosen as the speaking role of Lavender Brown. As far as I'm concerned, in regards to the film universe, or the film canon, this then establishes those characters with those traits, especially when the direction of those films is being partially overseen by the author of the books. Ergo, in the film adaptation of this book canon, Hermione is absolutely white, and the character of Lavender Brown is absolutely black, and doing anything to change that is then breaking canon. But then this raises the interesting and hotly debated question. What exactly is canon, and what exactly is an established character? And what classes a character as being established? Does a massively successful film franchise override the original canon of a book? Does a film franchise where the author of the books was very heavily involved in their creation then override the canon of a book again? Does the very fact that J.K. Rowling did not object to Emma Watson portraying Hermione Granger therefore establish as canon that the character of Hermione is white? This is all very much for you to decide yourself. But now I'm just going to throw out a couple of extra little curveballs towards this particular topic. The entire defense for Hermione Granger being black, or being able to be portrayed by someone who is black, is the notion that because her ethnicity is never expressly stated in the book, you can therefore do that. Okay, that is a completely valid point. Which then raises the point, just because an author says something outside of the book, does that then make that thing canon? Because after all, if it's not in the book expressly, it's not true. by this logic, therefore the case of Albus Dumbledore being a homosexual is now instantly called into question, because that is never mentioned in the book. It was only ever stated verbally by J.K. Rowling outside of the officially published books. And this, again, just throws into light a whole new angle as to what exactly is established character, and can we therefore use sources outside of published books, even just the word of an author, to establish something as canon in a universe. However, I actually believe that the saga of Dumbledore being gay also sheds a little bit of light on this current race-changing, race-baiting issue. When J.K. Rowling expressly stated verbally outside of the canon of the books that Albus Dumbledore was in fact gay, she made a somewhat off-the-cuff remark by saying, "I would have told you earlier if I knew it would make you so happy." This to me implies that she is quite happy to retcon or alter some of her own original source material, even her own original intentions, even if they aren't expressly stated of her source material, in order to garner public support and positive press coverage. Now, this might seem like a somewhat bold assertion of mine that she is simply jumping on this bandwagon in order to gain some positive press attention by stirring up a little bit of needless controversy, or a non-troversy, as some people would call it. And so it is, ladies and gentlemen, that I will present to you my final exhibit in this court of public opinion. And that is this drawing. This is a drawing of the cast of Harry Potter, done by J.K. Rowling herself, and features many of the main characters of the book, including, as you can see here, her own hand-drawn idea of what Hermione Granger looks like in her mind. Now, there is no particular shading on this drawing to indicate that her skin is supposed to be any darker than all of the white characters around her. Her facial features are very similar to the known white characters who are the same age. Again, this in itself is not conclusive evidence that this character is supposed to be white. After all, this depiction could be someone who looks similar to either of these examples. Once again, I believe this is down to you to decide what this particular piece of evidence implies. So before we conclude this, I'd like to quickly look at one piece of absolute non-evidence that's been bouncing around the internet for the last couple of days. People have been posting screenshots and photographs of a certain sentence from one of the books, which reads, "Hermione's white face was sticking out from behind a tree." And they are claiming that this sentence is absolute proof that Hermione is in fact white-skinned. However, this is simply not the case. This is simply a rephrasing of a common metaphor to turn white with fear. Colours are often used as a means of showing emotion, and actually it varies quite widely from culture to culture, such as some cultures you'll say that someone has turned green with envy. And I believe a short excerpt from the paper Emotion, Metaphors, and Cross-Linguistic Conceptualization of Emotions covers this reasonably well. White is associated with a wide range of negative emotions, such as fear, fury, nervousness, shock, anger, and other emotions of fear and anger types. It must be noted that all of the above discussed colours, namely green, yellow, grey, and white, denote, when used in reference to facial colour, general pallor of the skin. In other words, when they are used in reference to facial colour, they are used metaphorically and refer to more or less the same colouring. That is, the real facial colour is never green or yellow or grey or white. All these expressions are different metaphoric indications of the same denoted pallor, and differ only pragmatically in their cultural evaluation. Differences in their cultural conceptualization, and not in real physiology, determine the range of emotions these color terms can denote. So the "her white face from behind a tree" is just a goddamn metaphor. I know J.K. Rowling is a pretty terrible author, but even she is not bad enough to write someone's race into a book in a sentence as awkward or janky as that. And now, some closing thoughts. Given all of the evidence, J.K. Rowling's original artwork, the cover art provided by every single copy of the book imaginable, J.K. Rowling's involvement in the films and lack of protest at a white actress portraying Hermione, and the reasonable inference that can be drawn from the characters' names and locations, even the stereotype of the slightly snobbish, stuck-up, disdainful know-it-all is considerably more a stereotype of a white person than a black person. With all of these things put together, I think we can quite safely say that the actual original intention of J.K. Rowling was for the character of Hermione Granger to be white. And the deep-rooted cynic in me says that the casting of a black woman in this role was simply an attempt to cause some controversy online by playing the good old race-baiting card in order to garner some free publicity, and give people a good old excuse to get some of that virtue signaling going on their social media, Rowling included. Do I care that in this particular imagining of the Harry Potter universe that Hermione is being played by a black person? Not at all. I could not even give one single damn, even if I tried. Which you'd think would be counter-indicated by the fact that I have just made a 20-something long-minute video about it. But since I'm not a Harry Potter fan or in any way invested in the franchise, I don't actually care. I just find the controversy and the evidence around this to be somewhat interesting. And it's been really interesting seeing the different reactions from every single side around this. Because it just seems to be an excuse for people to play the race card and get riled up and feel morally superior to people by shouting racist at people who are confused by why an established character has changed so much for no discernible reason. We saw the exact same thing with the cries of misogyny when Thor was changed to a woman for no reason whatsoever, and when the crew of Ghostbusters was changed from male to female, again, for no reason whatsoever. The mainstream media has greeted these changes, of course, with the predictable cheers of progressiveness at how women and people of colour are now being better portrayed in the media. The real question here is, would the reaction be the same if we recast something like Charlie's Angels with a cast of men? Or if we reshot the popular series Shaft with a white guy as the main protagonist? I can't help but think that all we'd hear would be how it was racist and misogynist to do so.